Good evening. It's good to see everyone. Does everybody have a three-cycle approach book? We got anybody new that doesn't have a book yet? All right, so we left off last week. We had started cycle 2, and I sprinkle in just a little bit of cycle 3, just because it's the way my mind works. It's easy for me to think about cycle 2 with the first 4 time periods being the book of Genesis, basically. So we're going to start by reviewing the 17 time periods. But before I do that, again, my request is when you're in class, you don't have your book open, because if I ask you a question and all you have to do is look down at your book, it doesn't really mean that you're learning it. All you're doing is reading it. But one thing I do want to make mention of, because we did kind of sprinkle in some cycle 3, I'd mentioned at the beginning of class that this book consists of Brother Bob Waldron's third cycle, and then I called it my third cycle because I changed his third cycle, and so I either get credit or blame, whichever one you want to give. But his third cycle does not match up with his second cycle, so it's very confusing to me. So I threw it in there just so that you would have it, but I'm not going to look at it. I'm not going to use it. My recommendation is if you don't want to be confused out of your mind, that you don't use it, but that's your call. The stories for his third cycle don't match up. I think it's specifically with the Exodus, and so it's like, well, now we're having to learn two cycles and then the third cycle. So I just wanted to make note of that. So as we've mentioned before, we're going to keep reviewing. So we had a quiz on the first cycle, and I think everybody did a pretty good job. Still had some that missed just a couple. So we're going to continue to review those, and then we'll pick back up with the second cycle. So, all right. I'll give you the first one, before the flood. So let's keep going. So so it's before the flood. Now you go. All right, so some of you are looking at me like, okay, I can't believe we're going over this because I know this like the back of my hand. And some of you are looking at me like, why are you such an idiot? So,
You just can't read people's faces.
yeah, I don't know. I think I'm reading some of them pretty well. This is obviously for your benefit. It's for all of our benefits. But this is what we're going to continue to use from here, even when we get into the 3.5-year study. For those of you that are parents and that are grandparents, this is extremely beneficial. For the kids, also, if you're going to be teaching downstairs, these are things that you need to know. I know that the hand motions, maybe you think that they're kind of ridiculous, but we talked in our teacher training class about how important using as many of the senses as possible. And if you were to walk up to one of these kids that knows the 17 time periods pretty well, and you just went like this, they would know exactly what you're doing. So that's the reason that we're doing this. So now I'm going to go around the room. We're going to start in reverse. All right? So the last one, letters to the Christians. And what comes before letters to the Christians, Erica?
I know it word. I'm crazy about remembering.
April? All right, she's about to say the life of Christ. So,
Yeah.
all right. So, who came to establish the early church? Norm. All right. We have the life of Christ, and before the life of Christ, there was a period of what, Gil? All right. The years of silence, and prior to the years of silence was what, Miss Francis? All right. Return from captivity. All right. So this is an easy one. Okay. Jesse? Captivity. See, I like you, man. All right, so before the captivity, there was somebody that was, or a group that was by themselves. Who was that, Ken? All right, Judah alone. And before Judah was alone, what did we have? Andy? The divided kingdom. All right, so this next one's pretty easy too. What's before the divided kingdom, Mr. Bill? The united kingdom. All right, and before there was a kingdom of kings, how did the people go about their business? Mr. Tim, what come before the united kingdom? The judges. All right, and prior to the judges, we have what, Clarissa? All right, invasion and conquest. And before the invasion and conquest, they were doing what, Bonnie? They were wandering in the wilderness. And before they wandered in the wilderness, they had done what, Lena?
I knew all the other ones.
All right. Shannon, what were they doing before the wandering in the wilderness? Okay. Miss Sue. All right, Lena got it. It was the Exodus. All right, so before the Exodus, we had a group of special men, I'll say. And what were those, Marissa? The patriarchs. All right, so before the patriarchs, we had what? We just learned about this in a lesson. Nate? All right, the scattering of the people. Before the scattering of the people, we had what major event? Lauren? The flood. All right, obviously the first one then is before the flood. You see, whenever you work it backwards, it's a little bit harder, but I think that it's just another memory tool, learning tool to kind of help you get it. So keep working on those. So if you were to ask me again, well, what do we need to study? What do we need to know? I would say every week. I would say every day you need to be looking at over the 17 time periods. I mean, you need to know them forward and backward, because when you know this extremely well, then the rest of it becomes a lot easier, because you know these like the back of your hand, and you can just hear one and you know what's before it and what's after it. And like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, a great way to study is you look over them, take you a blank sheet of paper, and then you write them out, and you go back and check it. That's the way that I would study this. That's the way that I would study cycle 2, is you learn cycle 2 for so many time periods, and you write them out, check yourself, and to me that's probably the best way to study. All right, so cycle 2, before the flood, and again, these are the events that we're going to put into the box. If you think of the 17 time periods as 17 boxes, now we're putting the stories in the box, and then with cycle 3, we'll add the text to those events within the box. So we've talked about this one now several times, so everybody should know kind of the events that go along with that. So what's the first one? Creation. All right, so we got creation. What book of the Bible is that? Man, y'all are good. All right, what comes after the creation? Oh, I got click happy. What is it? What book of the Bible is that? Man, y'all are really good. All right, what's after Adam and Eve in the garden? First sin. What chapter is that? Chapter 3. All right, what's after the first sin? Cain and Abel. What chapter is that? Chapter 4. And what's in chapter 5? Generations. All right, so how do we remember which books the generations are in? All right, 5 and 10. Man, see, y'all remember all this. You were not even going to have to go over cycle 3. So another way to think of the generation chapters is you hit the fast forward button. Because if you didn't hit the fast forward button and you got to go through all of these actual generations, the Bible would obviously be volumes and volumes. And so we've got chapter 5, chapter 10. What other chapter has some generations? Chapter 11. All right, so these are the events that we need to remember with before the flood. And then moving on to the flood. What are the things that we talked about with the flood? All right. So we've got the flood itself, and this is where it got a little bit squirrely a couple of weeks ago, because I divided this up into the beginning of the flood and the end of the flood. So I'm not going to confuse anybody, or try not to tonight. So the flood itself, but do you remember what chapters the flood kind of is included in? All right, 6 through 8. So I'm not going to quiz you on that right now, Since we discussed it, to see if you remember it. All right, so after the flood itself, in Genesis chapter 9, what do you have discussed in Genesis chapter 9? Ken?
Meat was given for food.
Okay, so we've got that event. And these are, I was honest with you before, I'm going to be honest with you again. These are things, a couple of these that I don't often think of when I think of Noah comes out of the ark and we've got these events taking place. I remember one event, and it's the Rainbow Covenant. All right, so I'm just telling you as a teacher, if I was going to grade your quiz, I really care about the flood itself, and I care about the Rainbow Covenant. If you get a couple of these other ones wrong, I'm not going to count off that many points because I like y'all. All right, so we've got meat given for food, and what else in chapter 9? All right, the law of capital punishment. What else? All right, so we got the Rainbow Covenant, and then finally, okay, curse of Canaan. I heard a couple of different things, and I was like, those didn't sound the same. All right, so we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Obviously, the situation with Noah and his drunkenness and the way that situation was handled. And then, again, Genesis chapter 10 is the transition from the flood to the scattering of the people with the generations of Noah. All right, so moving on now, what's the next time period? Oh. You got to remember the scattering, Norm. The scattering comes before the patriarchs. All right, so we've got the scattering of the people. And what are the things that we've talked about that we need to remember with the scattering of the people? This one should be an easy one. All right, so we've got the Tower of Babel. And again, those of you that are in the Sunday morning adult class, we just actually spent a whole lesson talking about the Tower of Babel. And then what was the outcome of the Tower of Babel being built? All right, so the languages were divided, hence the scattering of the people. Because if I'm today talking to Todd and Norm about something, and we're all on the same page, then I wake up tomorrow and all of a sudden Norm is speaking a different language, I'm not going to hang around with Norm. So languages were divided, and April's already told us part of Genesis chapter 11 is also talking about the generations. And so we have the generations from Shem to who? All right, from Shem to Abram, which brings us to what time period, Norm?
The patriarchs.
All right, so now we're at the patriarchs. All right, so if before the flood and the scattering of the people covers from Genesis chapter 1 to Genesis chapter 11, then what does the patriarchs cover as far as the book of Genesis? The rest of it, which is what? 12 through 50. All right, so the patriarchs, again, this should be an easy one. Who are the three patriarchs that we remember? All right, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then the fourth one that leads us to the next time period. All right, so we've got the story of Joseph, and that helps transition us from the patriarchs to the Exodus. All right, so did we actually get through the Exodus 2 weeks ago? Okay, so this is where we left off. All right, so we've got Joseph, and Joseph is pretty high in the land of Egypt, but do things really stay with a great situation for the children of Israel even after Joseph dies? What happens? All right, so there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph, and then so what happens? All right, so that's the first one. So when we start the book of Exodus, there's a Pharaoh that arose that did not know Joseph, so they're put into bondage, and this Pharaoh recognizes what about this group of people? They're a threat. All right, they're large, they're a threat. And so what's the method for getting rid of or trying to subdue this group of people so that they don't build some massive army to overtake them? All right, kill all the babies. And it was during this time, who was born? All right, so we've got the birth of Moses during this time. And So since Moses is born and he's a male, what was supposed to happen? He's supposed to have been killed. And what did his mom do? All right. Hit him, put him in a basket. Who found him? All right. Pharaoh's daughter. And so he's raised in the beginning by who? All right. His mother was the nurse, and he was raised as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. So after he gets on up to, I think he's 40, he goes out and he's got a mind to really start taking care of his people. And he sees a situation where one of the Egyptian men and one of a guy from the Hebrew nation are fighting. And how did he handle that situation? All right, so he kills the Egyptian. So the next day, he's out there and he's got two of his own brothers that are fighting against each other. And what happens? Yeah, well, you're going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian? What does that tell Moses? The word is out. And so since the word is out, Moses said, I'm out. So he is ultimately rejected at that point by his people. What did they question him? Exactly. Who made you ruler and a judge over us? So he's rejected by his people, and he flees to the wilderness. And things are just going great. How long was he in the wilderness? All right, so he's in the wilderness for 40 years. Things are going great. And, he just walks upon this natural occurrence that happens just commonly out in the wilderness, I guess, right? What happened? What event? All right, so we've got the burning bush. And what was the story there with the burning bush? Okay. A burning bush that's talking? All right, what did the bush say? Okay, what else? All right. I got a job for you. And Moses said, let's go. Sign me up. All right, so Moses, he's told by God that he had a job for him. He was going to send him back to Egypt, the place that he had fled, and he's going to send him to Pharaoh to give the word, let my people go. And Moses did not want to go, did not think that he was capable of doing the job, but with the help of Aaron, he goes back and goes to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said, yes, take them. I don't need them, right? All right, no. So we've got the hardening of Pharaoh's heart, and that took place over a period of 10 what? All right, so we've got the plagues. So one of the things, like with this time period in particular, I think that most everybody kind of remembers the stories. Maybe we kind of sometimes get them a little mixed up, but once you just kind of talk through it, see how they all just kind of line up. And this is a time period that actually has a lot of stories in the box. But again, once you start kind of thinking about it and taking your time and going through it, hopefully they make sense. So eventually we get to the 10th plague, which was what? Death of the firstborn. So finally Pharaoh lets them go and just says, after they're gone, good riddance. Happy that y'all are gone. All right, no. So what does Pharaoh end up doing? All right, sends the army after them. And so the Israelites, they've got the army of the Egyptians behind them, and they've got what in front of them? The Red Sea. Boy, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. So what happens? All right, so the parting of the sea. So they are able to cross the Red Sea on dry ground. And after they cross the Red Sea, where are they heading? They're heading to Mount Sinai. All right, so whenever they get to Mount Sinai, what are some of the things that take place while they are at Mount Sinai? Okay. Laws given, what'd you say? Todd said, we're going to take this big bucket and just make it real small. All right, so you've got all of the things that happen at Mount Sinai. So we've got the law that's given. What'd you say? So you've got the golden calf. So whenever the people come out of Egypt, I mean, they just automatically submit to God, and they're like, thank you, this is great, you're going to be our God, right? No. So they're constantly complaining. What was the situation with the golden calf? Why was the golden calf even built? All right, so whoever you put in charge, he must be dead. So we need somebody to lead us. So we might as well just make something to lead us, right? So you've got all of these events that are happening at Sinai. And then whenever they leave Sinai, where are they ultimately going? Why? Who were the promises made to? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So they've got the promise of the promise of the promised land. So they're headed to the promised land. And before they get to the promised land, where do they stop off? All right, so they stop off at Kadesh Barnea, and it is at Kadesh Barnea that what happens? I thought she said they send swines. I'm like, all right, so they send out the spies. How many do they send out? Why 12? All right, one from each tribe. And so this is one of the little hand things. So you've got 10 are bad, 2 are good. As if you couldn't remember that. It's a good one for the kids, though. 10 are bad, 2 are good. All right, so the 10 that are bad, they come back, obviously, and they give a bad report. And you've got Joshua and Caleb that are saying, we can do this. God's with us. It's going to be no problem. The people went along with what the 10 had to say. And so they didn't go in. And that leads us to the end of the time period of the Exodus. So this is just because this is in my mind. So I'm just going to go ahead and we're going to keep sprinkling in a little bit of the third cycle because I'm a little concerned we're not going to get to all of it in the end. So where does the Exodus start in reference to the Bible? All right, so it starts with the Exodus. Is it entirely just within the Exodus? No. So we've got Exodus, and then what other books or book is included in the Exodus? So I heard Numbers, I heard Deuteronomy. All right, so you've got Leviticus, Exodus, Leviticus, and then I heard Numbers. Is it all of Numbers? No, it's not all of Numbers. So one of the ways that I remember where it stops in Numbers is, what's an unlucky number? Stops in Numbers 13. That's an unlucky number. All right. So Israel refuses to go in, and because of that, now we end up wandering in the wilderness. And so when we think about the events, the stories that are going to go into this bucket, obviously the very first one it's kind of a given. So they're sentenced to wander in the wilderness. This is their punishment. And how long was this going to happen? Okay, so it's going to be until all the men of war basically had died. And after this, the people are so sorry that they had not obeyed God that they're just going to follow right along with everything, all of God's plans now, right? Oh, rebellion. All right, so we've got some rebellion in the wilderness, and we've got 3 people in particular that we always refer to as the leaders of the rebellion. Who are those? All right, so you've got Korah, Dathan, and Abiram that lead the rebellion. And what's the outcome of this rebellion? Okay. So, all right, we're not there yet. So what happened though? What's that? Okay. So the ground opens up, and look, I've seen the ground open up before. Like I've had a drill rig fall over because the ground just opened up, but it didn't swallow nobody, and then come back together. All right, this is an event like no one had ever seen. So the ground opens up, swallows up all of the people there. And so after this, the people are like, whew, all right, we know God's in charge, and so whatever he says goes, right? The very next day, remember what happened? They were grumbling, and who did they accuse of killing the people? They accused Moses and Aaron of killing the people. And so after that, the Lord sent a plague among them, and over 14,000 ended up dying. Moses and Aaron ended up stepping in for them, and they were able to make atonement for the people. And so after that, Todd had mentioned that Aaron is chosen. And how do we know that Aaron is chosen? All right, so Aaron's rod budded and produced ripe almonds, and this was to show the people once again who was chosen as high priest. And so out of all of the staffs, his is the one that budded, obviously signifying that he was the one that is in charge. Now, again, I'm going to be honest with you. This is one of them that there are some things thrown in here that I don't often remember and think too much about. So we know about Miriam. We know about, obviously, Moses' sister from the very beginning when he was born. And so she's obviously with them. So after the budding of Aaron's rod, we have Miriam that actually dies. And then we've talked about some of the grumbling that takes place with the people. And along the way, what had God told them? Did he say, you're just going to have to fend for yourselves, good luck? He said that you follow me, I will take care of you. And yet they continued to grumble, and there's a situation over in Numbers chapter 20 where there was no water for the congregation, and what happened? This is one of them, if you think about it. I mean, for all of the years, from the time that Moses saw the burning bush until now, the things that Moses had witnessed, the power of God, the grumbling of the people. I'm not making excuses for Moses, don't get me wrong, but you could understand why there would be some frustration just with the whole situation. But him and Aaron did not give God credit for what took place, and so they sinned against God. And what was going to be their punishment because of this? All right, so they're not going to be able to enter the promised land because of that. So after this, after the sin of Moses and Aaron, the people are coming up to Edom, and they had asked the king, can we pass through? And what was the king of Edom worried about? Anybody remember that? Norm?
He was afraid of them because of the numbers. He had heard about what was going on. They'd been in the area for a while, wandering around. So he was not going to let them go through, so they were going to have to go on.
Yep. So he did not want them coming into the land and plundering the land, and so he told them no, refused for them to be able to come in, and so they end up passing by Edom, not going through Edom. And after this occurrence, this is all kind of in Numbers chapter 20. We actually have the death of Aaron. So again, the way my mind works, this ain't the easiest kind of for me to remember, so that I'd have to look at this several times to be able to remember that. But it's after they pass by Edom that they're not able to go through Edom that we end up having Aaron dying. And then in Numbers chapter 21, we have the situation that Gil has alluded to earlier. And what was that, Gil? All right, so the serpents. And once again, the people became impatient. They're grumbling. They're blaming God. Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? Here we go again. We all just going to die. There's no food. There's no water. Woe is me. You're such a horrible father. And so the Lord sent fiery serpents amongst them, and they didn't just get bit and their legs swell up. What happened? They died. All right. And so what was made to be their healing, their savior? All right. So we've got the bronze serpent, and then it's still while they're in the wilderness, after the situation with the fiery serpents and the bronze serpents, they are conquering a couple people that are around them. And so I would kind of throw these together, both the Amorites and also Bashan that they conquer. And then it's after this we come to the story of the donkey. And who was? All right, so we've got Balaam. And what was the situation there?
Took off and on a donkey and tried to get away from the whole situation. And then God put an angel there in the path, but he couldn't see. But the donkey saw it, and the donkey started talking to him. And then he started beating on the donkey, and the donkey it was like, ah. And then he saw the angel and went, oh, thank you, donkey.
So you can always remember that the donkey story took place in the wandering in the wilderness. All right, this is in the book of Numbers. So in this situation with this conversation between Balaam and Balak, what was ultimately Balak trying to do? All right, so he's trying to make Israel sin, and what was he told could make that happen? Use the women of the land. Nope. It's the M word, though. All right. So you've got the Midianites. And so you end up with the fornication with the Midianites, which ultimately led to what with the people? What did it cause the people to do? So they ended up worshiping what? That's right. So they ended up worshiping Baal because of this. So obviously it's very true that if you intermingle with people that are living in idolatry, that don't consider God as their God, then it will pull you away. And that's a story that we see repeated over and over and over in the scriptures. Norm?
I thought of an interesting thing here. Wasn't Jethro the father-in-law of Moses? Wasn't he a Midianite? He was a priest of Midian.
Yes.
So these are Moses' in-laws.
Yeah.
It's ironic. You're not the people he married into, the family he married into, was forbidden from marrying into any of the state of Israel.
Yep. All right, so at the beginning of the wandering in the wilderness, there was a census taken. And why would there be need for a second census? All right, so you got to make sure that all of the men of war have died off. And so there is a second census that is taken at this point. And had all the men of war died off? Okay. That's a trick question. Good job, Norm. All right, so there were two left. Obviously, Joshua and Caleb were left. And after the second census, because of the fornication with the Midianites, did God just let that just go on? Right. So after that, we have the slaughter of the Midianites. And we know that Moses was not allowed to go in. And so one of the ways that Brother Waldron actually kind of describes the book of Deuteronomy is basically speeches that Moses is kind of giving the people. It's almost like a farewell address to the people. In Deuteronomy 6, verse 5, it kind of summarizes the book of Deuteronomy. It says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might." And again, this is kind of Moses' farewell address that he's given to the people. And then after this, God allows Moses, so they're basically on the precipice of the promised land. And what does God allow Moses to do? All right, so he allows them to see the promised land. And again, because of his sin, he's not able to go in there. And so before they are going in, we have the death of Moses. And then whenever they are getting ready to cross into the promised land, there is another river crossing that takes place. And so we have the crossing of the Jordan. And then after they cross the Jordan, what takes place for the people? Nope, not yet. Yeah, we're still in the wandering in the wilderness. We're not to the invasion and conquest yet. Ain't no fighting taking place yet, Norm. All right, so that did take place. What's that, Marissa? All right, so yes, that happens actually in the invasion and conquest. So what was established after the 10th plague? All right, so we have the observing of the Passover, and this is just for reference, this is Joshua 5, verses 10 through 12. It says, "While the people of Israel were encamped at Gilgal, they kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month in the evening of the plains of Jericho. And the day after the Passover, on that very day, they ate of the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. And the manna ceased the day after they ate of the produce of the land. And there was no longer manna for the people of Israel, but they ate of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year." I think that's such a significant passage because God had been providing for them in every way. Now they're literally fixing to step into the promised land. And so now what was told about the promised land even whenever the 12 spies went? It's a land flowing with milk and honey. I mean, it's got grape clusters, 2 men can't even carry them. That's what the picture always depicts, right? And so they're now into this land. It's got everything that they're going to need, and so there's no longer need for manna. And so on that day, manna ceased, and they were able to eat of the produce of the land. Again, that's in Joshua chapter 5. All right, so they've crossed the Jordan. They are ready to now begin the what? Invasion and conquest. All right, so whenever they first enter the land, if you think of the land of Canaan as like a rectangle, where do they enter in relation? If you break the rectangle up into 3 sections, where do they enter at? The top, the middle, or the bottom? All right, so they enter at the middle or the central region. And what do they come upon first? All right, so they come to Jericho, and what's the story with Jericho? All right, everybody remember the song? And the walls came tumbling down. All right, so after they take Jericho, where do they go next? All right, and they just take it. You know, it's this revolving cycle of, it's like you would just think that the people would learn, just do what God says. Things go so much better. And then you look at our own lives, and it's like, we know that things go so much better if we do what God says, but yet we're human, and we don't always do what God says. So why did they lose? All right, so yeah, Achan had taken some of the things when they were told not to take some of the things. So he obviously has to suffer the consequences of that. But ultimately they end up taking Jericho, Bethel, and Ai, and then they stake their claim in the land of Shechem. So again, from a teacher's perspective, what I want you to think about is whenever they enter the promised land, they enter in the middle or in the central part. I think that it's pretty easy to remember Jericho. and especially AI with the situation there. But I'm not going to count off as much if you don't get the 2 subpoints, as long as you remember central campaign. So after they defeat the central area, do they go north or south? All right, so they go south. And so again, that's what I really want you to remember, central, and they go to the south. And so if they go from the central to the south, what's left after that? All right, so we've got the northern campaign after that. And what was the situation with the Gibeonites? Boy, they were some good tricksters.
They pretended that they were from the land far, far away. They must have had some intel on about these tribes getting killed off, because they did not want to be known as Canaanites. So they changed their clothes, made them holy, kind of like what kids wear. And then they fooled Joshua, and Joshua made the mistake of not asking God. Going to God first, used his own wisdom.
Norm, you want to ring the bell for us? So that's a good point. Now when I see kids with holes in their clothes, I'm going to be like, what are you, a Gibeonite? That's a good one. All right, so with the invasion and conquest, remember central campaign, southern campaign, and then the northern campaign. And then we'll pick up here. We're going to review, so we'll review this again. But make sure that you are reviewing yourself and that you for sure know cycle 2 with the time periods up through the wandering in the wilderness. So make sure that you know cycle 2 through the wandering in the wilderness. Is that enough of a hint? All right. Thanks, everybody.